to welcome those who will be watching the video. Moorhead Church of Christ, Wednesday evening Bible study. We are studying through the book of Job, continuing our study through it. And tonight we will be going through chapter 31. Not sure if we'll get all the way through because instead of there being 20 verses, 25 verses, 28, 32, there's 40. That's a lot of material. So I'm not sure. I think we can get through 23 and we'll see how we get through the rest of it. But this chapter has a lot of good material for us to consider here. So as I usually do, I give a summary of the previous chapter. And you'll recall that in chapter 29, Job is really telling us really how good things were before the great suffering. I mean, his life was as good as it could be. He was, his relationship with God was really good from his perspective. I mean, everything was just sort of perfect. And then when Job gets to chapter 30, he's now sort of telling you, and then this happened. And so in chapter 30, he is really explaining to us the present reality of his life, which is in comparison with chapter 29 is like night and day, okay? So now things have been turned upside down. Life is not so good. He feels far away from God. And really, he just wants to share really the sufferings that he's going through all by himself. Remember, his friends aren't there for him. And, he's got all of the experience of loss and suffering. And he's really there by himself. And there's really no end in sight. And that's how chapter 30 goes. So here in chapter 31, this is a chapter highlighting really the personal ethics of Job's character. Job upholds his integrity in the face of all who have accused him of being a practicing sinner. Now remember, the reason why they were accusing him of being a practicing sinner is because
he has all these afflictions.
Because he was suffering. And so the mindset at that time was, if you suffer, you must be a sinner. God must be punishing you for something you did. And so because Job was involved with great suffering, friends thought he did some great sin. He hadn't repented of it. And that's why he was going through all that. But Job in chapter 31 will maintain his innocence and his righteousness before God. Job wants all of those who are listening to his speech to know that he's certainly not a hypocrite. But he is one who has lived a consistent life of godliness through the course of his life, and he's always done what was right before God. And this isn't really Job. We shouldn't see this as Job patting himself on the back. But remember, he's saying this in really the face of all those who are trying to defame him and really sort of treat him as an evildoer. So it's not Job sort of boasting about his righteousness, but he's defending it, because he's being really wrongly accused of being an evildoer. Okay, Brian, would you like to read 1 through 4 for us, please?
Yep. I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? What would be my portion from God above, and my heritage from the Almighty on high? Is not calamity for the unrighteousness and disaster for the workers of iniquity? Does not he see my ways and numbers all my steps?
Okay, so here in verses 1 through 4, Job begins by declaring really his chastity. Okay, Job again is an honorable man, and what Job here, again, verse 1, he says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? And Job has made a solemn agreement between himself and his eyes, if you will, in regard to preserving his sexual purity. Today we live in what we call a sexually loose society. And really, for those who've come out of more conservative societies, this is really shocking to come into an environment like this. So in public institutions of education, for instance, they teach students about human sexuality really is from an atheistic point of view. In other words, it's your body And, from this perspective, the idea that absence, why would you do absence? The idea is it seems unrealistic, and, it's hard for young people to control their bodies. And, there really isn't any universal moral sexual standard. But, the only thing you have to keep in mind with, in terms of human sexuality, is as long as you don't involve yourself with rape, pretty much, it's your body. You do with it whatever you want. So you can have casual sex with the opposite sex, the same sex, multiple people. Just make sure that when you do this, you practice safe sex. That's the extent of human sexuality today. And the idea is a safe sex, the idea that you don't get a venereal disease or something like that. And I'm like, that seems kind of like a shocking term to use. If you're having sex outside of marriage, it's not safe. You're not going to be safe before God. It's going to affect your eternity. But this is a society that we live in. And of course, God is the maker of man. He made us male and female, and therefore sexual beings. It was not his intention in making males and females that they would have casual sex with multiple partners and essentially live their life in that way. Human sexuality is taught, as God has taught us in the Bible, places sexual fulfillment exclusively within the covenant of marriage between one man and one woman. Therefore, outside of a covenant of marriage, single men and women are to be abstinent, that is, without sex, until they get married. And we appreciate, the example that Joseph, remember when he was in slavery and he was taken into Potiphar's home, and he sort of became the one who was sort of over his home to deal with his affairs. And at some point, his wife had eyes for him. And there was a day came where she put out all the servants except for Job, and she essentially wanted to have adultery. She wanted to commit adultery with Joseph. But in Genesis 39, verse 9, the latter part of the verse, Joseph says, "How then could I do this great evil?" And he says, "And sin against
God.
So a lot of people that think when they're involved with, having sex with somebody else, it's really between the two of them. And so if you're okay with it and I'm okay with it, then it's okay. The problem is that when it's not in the context of marriage, the idea is you're sinning against God. There's a law. And the idea is that God intends sexual activity to be in the framework of marriage. Now we know that Job was a married man, according to Job 2 and verse 9. Yet he shows us that even married men, not to mention single men, have wandering eyes that look at a woman with sexual lust and commit adultery with them in their hearts, which Jesus condemns as a sin, Matthew 5 verse 28. So it's not just sort of the act itself, but the idea that you would commit that in your mind, in your heart, you become guilty of adultery before God. So the eyes of man are used to lust sexually. The eyes of man, when used to lust sexually, really is a gateway to the mind and heart where the mental adultery takes place. The idea that you're looking, you see the billboard, you see the mannequin, you see the lady that's dressed inappropriately. The idea is that you do that, and the idea is it comes through your eyes, and really the adultery takes place in your heart. And Job is showing us, and humanity in verse 1, that there is a sexual standard established outside of man. In other words, man doesn't set the standard. So when you go to a public institution of education and they're saying, sort of, we don't really care, just make sure you practice safe sex, they're really ignoring the law of God. Wouldn't it be more responsible to tell them, hey, this is what you should be doing? Is that you're going to be better off, you're going to create so less, you're not going to create all this misery by getting, somebody gets pregnant, and then the idea that a child comes into the world and there's not going to be a mother and father for it, or the world says, just go murder the child and then you're done with. There's a lot of misery. The idea of getting, you're sexually promiscuous. There's all kinds of venereal diseases. The idea that man has the ability to control himself. Here's what we have Job is. He's saying, I made a covenant with my eyes. He's he's recognizing for us, or he's teaching us here that it is possible to have self-control. And Job is teaching us here how to avoid committing adultery in one's heart. It is by making a covenant with one's eyes not to look on a woman with lustful eyes. Now, going back to Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife, when Joseph essentially indicated he wasn't interested. In other words, I'm responsible for his home. I'm not going to have this sexual relationship with you. Potiphar's wife would not accept the no. And in Genesis 39, verse 12, it says, and she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand, and he fled, and he went outside. And the idea is you know what? Joseph had sexual self-control. Here's a woman who's pretty much thrown herself at him, and he realizes, people was like, why did he run? He ran because he was tempted, and he didn't want to give in to that enticement. And so the Christian man or woman, if we're going to maintain our sexual purity before God, must avoid sexual lust with our eyes, averting our eyes from women or men who are not our spouses and who are dressed provocatively, they're inappropriately, and the idea is we have to avert our eyes, we maybe have to remove ourselves from situations in which there is sexual temptation, because we can so easily do that in our hearts.
She lied too, because he wouldn't have sex with her.
Well, yeah, because she had Potiphar's wife. She got his coat, and then she turned everything around and essentially said, he wanted to rape me, is what she was implying. He wanted to have relations with me, and so then that's how Joseph essentially got thrown in prison.
Until he started having his dreams and going crazy.
Right.
But this is kind of personal, but my mom always used to say when I was growing up, sexual thing came to the table talking about. She said, son, nobody's going to go to hell for masturbation. Yeah. And that's why I kind of want to bring that question up and stuff, because self-control, of course, you got to have that and stuff. But, and I was reading last night and night before, and the adultery is when, God wants you to walk godly with him, and you look at someone with a sexual intent, you've committed adultery. Is that with God?
Adultery is tied to a married individual. So if that person has sexual relations outside of the marriage, that's adultery.
The spiritual adultery would be?
Well, spiritual adultery would be somebody who is supposed to be in a covenant with God, and now instead of following God, they're practicing sin. They have basically some kind of idol. In other words, something now has their attention rather than God. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
I was wondering.
Yeah. Any questions about verse 1? I think it's really encouraging to read sort of what Job is saying. He said, I made a covenant with my eyes that I would not, how can I gaze on a virgin? In other words, I'm a responsible man, and Job is a righteous and a holy man. Part of that was being in self-control and doing the right thing in relation to his sexuality. There's no questions, comments. Let's go on to verse 2. Job continues. He said, and what is the portion of God from above, or the heritage of the Almighty from on high? And so Job asks a question in verse 2 that he will answer in verse 3. Verse 3, he says, is it not calamity to the unjust and disaster to those who work iniquity? And the idea is Job can see this sin for what it is. The idea is when you sin against God, God is essentially going to hold the sinner accountable. And if you're a righteous and godly man, you're always focused on doing what God wants you to do. Job is proving his point over and over again that I'm a righteous man because I'm really committed to God. I'm really committed to turning away from what I shouldn't do. And Job is essentially, if somebody's accusing him of being a hypocrite, essentially is really saying, and if I were doing this, this is what's going to happen to wicked people, or to me if I'm doing that, because God isn't going to put up with it. There is not going to be a heritage or a portion from God. You're not going to be blessed from God. You're not going to benefit from a relationship with God if you are involved with wickedness. Verse 4, Job says, does he, talking about God, not see my ways and number all my steps? What is Job implying here about God in verse 4? Okay, really, yeah, he's implying God's omniscience. The idea is that when you truly believe in God, if you truly believe in him, then you're going to keep in mind that he's omniscient, which means you're not going to be able to keep anything away from his knowledge. He's going to be able to know every word you said, to whoever you said it. He's going to know every deed that you did and where you did that. And so this helps you in terms of living in the right way before God, because you recognize God sees everything that you do. So why would you affirm God and be a believer of God and a follower of God if in reality you're really doing things that you shouldn't be doing? The idea is God knows about that. And this is, again, Job is understanding that, and this really underscores his righteousness. I know God. I know, he's a powerful God, and that he has this great ability to know everything essentially that's said and done. Okay?
But you're not going to get away with it.
Right.
A lot of people say, I can live this way, or I can do this, and I can do that. But when you look into the details of the Bible and it speaks to get what you're doing, you're going to answer for it eventually.
Right.
When you die, you're going to answer for it. You're not going to pass collect, or you're not going to pass collect or collect 200, however you say it. But you're going to pay the piper one
Right.
day
Right.
and stuff. So like I was saying yesterday, if you're right with God,
Yeah.
you should worry when your time comes.
Well, that's right, if
because-
you're right with God. So people think too much of the time. So if I can steal something in a store and nobody ever knows, well, that's not true, because even if the store manager doesn't know, the security people don't know, the cashiers don't know, I mean, God will know. And if God knows, then he knows, especially if you're a Christian, that you're not doing what's right. And if you're somebody who is wicked, and you say, well, I feel I'm justified to do this because, I don't make enough money, and I really want to get this. The idea is God knows your motivations, your intentions, and the fact that you steal something from others is something that is ungodly. You just don't take things that belong to others. So we're going to move into, so Job has kept himself from sexual impurity, and we're going to go into verses 5 through 8. So Ricky, do you have that by chance?
Yeah.
Do you want to read 5
If
through
I
8?
have walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance, and let God know my integrity. And my step has turned aside from the way, and my heart has gone after my eyes. And if any spot has stuck to my hands, then let me sow, and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out.
Okay, that's good right
Okay.
there, brother. Thank you. So Job has exhibited uprightness and honesty in his dealings with others. And so Job is really putting forth the idea that if you're not a man of integrity, a man of righteousness, why would you be so concerned about all of the things that you're doing? It's obvious that Job is really in tune with what righteousness is all about. And so again, he's really putting this out for his three friends. They're supposed to be in his corner, supporting him, and the idea that they sort of smeared his reputation. They assume he's a sinner. Not only that, but they assume he's lying, even though he's told them the truth. And he's really saying, listen, I'm not that kind of man. I'm God's man, okay? So in verse 5, he says, if I've walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened after deceit. And falsehood here, according to Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, talks about sort of the Hebrew word here means emptiness of speech or lying. And so the idea of lying, and then deceit there, the idea of deceiving somebody. And the idea is this is not something that you're going to find as character traits in somebody who is walking with God. This is something you're going to find with those who are really hypocrites, or those who really don't fear God, but you're not going to find it in somebody who is truly following after God. Verse 6, Job says, let him weigh me with accurate scales, that's what the New American Standard says, and let God know my integrity. Now, if his friends essentially think that Job is a sinner, he's a great sinner, that's why he's suffering, and that he's really sort of, being deceptive or lying about, what he's been involved with. Okay, Job is essentially, I want you to think about this. So he's already acknowledged that God is omniscient, the idea that God is in control, he's in power. Job is essentially saying, if there's anything that's on me, if there's any impropriety in my dealings with others, then God can prove my integrity by putting my integrity on his scales and weighing it. And what you'll see is that it's going to be just as I have always claimed, the idea that I'm a righteous and holy man. No one is going to say this if they know that they've been deceitful. If they're involved with falsehood, they're not going to essentially sort of challenge God to put him on some kind of scales to see if he sort of balances out in righteousness. They're not going to do that. But a righteous man who's trying to uphold his righteousness for the sake of his friends will certainly put this forward. Verse 7, Job says, if my step has turned from the way, or my heart followed my eyes, or if any spot has stuck to my hands, then he says in verse 8, let me sow and another eat, and let my crops be uprooted. Again, the idea is that you would not say these things unless you were a man of integrity. Job is confident that he is a righteous man in the sight of God. And Job is saying that if he has not lived a righteous life by being turned from the way, that is from the law of God, or if his heart followed his eyes, here he seems to be talking about given to sexual lust with his eyes, or if any spot has stuck to his hands, and here the implication seems to be that his hands are stained with sin, Job recognizes that he's going to suffer the consequences. And Job is essentially saying, I know that if I am this kind of man instead of a righteous man, then he's saying, this is what should happen. Let me sow and another eat, and my crops be approved. Job really pronounces or accepts a curse upon himself as a consequence for sin if he's guilty of these things. And he is more than happy to sort of take the loss if he's not really true to being a righteous man. This is what should happen. So, Tanya?
So if these are like his best friends or good friends, why are they, if they, should know him.
Yeah.
Like they, think they do, why are they so hard on him?
Yeah. Well, and this really goes to sort of a false theology of the day. And I've sort of brought out the idea is that the false theology of the day is if you suffer in your life for something, that always means that God is punishing you. Okay, so you can understand when Job incurs this great suffering, how they got there, because that's what they all believed, and Job himself may have believed that before it happened to him, because that's sort of typically what was believed, and that's what sort of came out earlier, the idea that this was something that the forefathers sort of came to, the idea. This is before, Tanya, too. There's no really scripture. Job is like one of the earliest of books. So they don't have the Bible like we do to really sort of understand that sometimes, like James talks about, God allows trials in our lives to, help us to grow stronger. Or sometimes God, Hebrews chapter 12, the idea that God disciplines us in some way, however that is, the idea so that we can really be the people of God that he wants us to be. But they didn't have access to James, and they didn't have access to what the Hebrew writer said. And so they're sort of left to sort of come to this on their own. And Job has already debunked that by saying, look, I can sort of point out people that are wicked. Do you know that they're not suffering? And if I point out several different examples of people doing things that are sinful and they're not suffering, that debunks the idea that I'm suffering because I'm a sinner, because here's sinners that aren't suffering. And so this is sort of where they're at. And so these friends that came out of their way to encourage him, really, even though Job has talked to him multiple times and tried to get things to see differently, they're adamant that Job is a sinner and God is punishing him, and Job needs to repent. And so you think, wow, what great friends. I've told you guys. I mean, you know me. You know what kind of guy I am. And yet you won't let go of that. And so Job, again, suffering all the loss of his family, suffering all the loss of his material wealth. The idea that his wife says, curse God and die. He's put outside the city. These young people are spitting on him and saying things to him. All these things are going on. And where are his three friends? They don't want anything to do with him because they don't want to get too close to him, support him, because they know he's suffering. If they get too close to him, support him, they might suffer. And that's just where their mindset is. And it's really a shame. So this becomes that much more important. Now, this is the last speech of Job. Job will be done here. And so you can understand why he would take the time, the last speech he gives, to really drive the point home. Listen, I'm a righteous man, and if I did this bad thing, this bad thing, this bad, then these things would happen to me. God would not be happy with me. I would suffer really from God's punishment. But I'm a righteous man. And that's really what Job is sort of maintaining. So that's a great question, Tanya. Let's go on to verses 9 through 12. So, Tanya, would you like to do a little reading? You want to read 9 through 12, please?
Yes. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or I have lurked at my neighbor's doorway, may my wife grind for another, and let others kneel down over her. For that would be a lustful crime. Moreover, it would be an iniquity punishable by judges. For it would be fire that consumes to a batten, and would uproot all my increase.
Okay. All right. So what we need to know here is that Job has been faithful to his wife, but he's saying sort of, if I've been involved with sexual immorality, now we're going beyond sort of mental adultery to really the actuality of carrying it out in the body. And Job has been faithful to his wife, but he says, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or I've lurked at my neighbor's doorway, he's essentially saying, I'm essentially bringing on destruction to myself. And so he denies sexual improper behavior. He has not been enticed by a woman to have unlawful sexual relations with her. And Job has said that he has not waited for really his neighbor's husband to leave, so the wife is alone, and essentially so that he could ravish his neighbor's wife. Job is a good man. He's an honorable man. He would never do such terrible things. And again, he's establishing his righteousness for his friends who think that he's some kind of sinner. Okay? So verse 10, the idea is that Job is saying, verse 9, if I've done this, if I've been enticed by this woman, if I've essentially worked at my neighbor's doorway to essentially have sexual relations with the neighbor's wife, then he says this in verse 10, may my wife grind for another and let others kneel down over. Now verse 10 is sort of self-imposed punishment. If I've done this, then this is what I should accept, okay? The punishment would be that Job would surrender his wife to another to be a master over her, and essentially his wife would grind for another. So the idea is that she would, according to Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, she would serve this other person as his slave. And the idea of maybe sort of like going out into the field, getting the wheat and sort of grinding it up. The second thing here, the second part of verse 10, he says, and let others kneel down over. He's essentially, this word kneel down, the Hebrew word means to bow down over in order to lie with a woman. And so the idea is a sexual intercourse. And some might see this really as being unfair to Job's wife. And sort of, from a modern perspective, some of these things are difficult. In other words, if Job was the guy that did this, why is he essentially, here's what should happen to my wife? But we need to understand that Job is saying that if he acted immorally in verse 9, the idea, or I should say that Job has constantly essentially said, if I've done something wrong, then I myself should sort of bear the punishment. So when we get into verse 10 here, Job is simply saying, in terms of his wife, that if it can be proven that I have engaged in sexual immorality with someone else's woman, with somebody else's wife, then it would only be fitting that essentially other men could essentially have my wife as punishment to me, sort of she would be shamed and I would be shamed. Okay? Any questions or comments about that? Okay. Verse 11, Job says, for that would be a lustful crime. He's talking about adultery. Moreover, it would be an iniquity punishable by the judges. So if I've done this terrible thing, it is this lustful crime, and the idea of it sort of being adultery. And Job does not downplay sin. That's one thing we find in Job is he calls it out. And a righteous man is not going to go on essentially saying, you know, this is bad, and if I've done it, then this is what's going to come to me. You know, if you're somebody who is a hypocrite, if you're somebody who doesn't really care, you're probably not going to want to pay a lot of attention to whether something's right or wrong, and the fact that you continually sort of essentially talk about your own doom, what's going to happen to you as a result of carrying out these crimes, breaking God's law. So Job affirms that adultery is a violation of God's law and is worthy of punishment by the judges, probably human judges. And Job is saying that if I've committed the terrible crime of adultery, I am deserving of the judicial punishment handed down for this crime. Again, when you're saying this, Job is talking to his friends. This ought to give them a reason to step back from their theology again in condemning Job. Who's going to do this if they're not a righteous man? Who is going to essentially keep saying, you know, I'm not this kind of guy, and if I did, I should get everything that's coming to me. I should get all that that's coming to me as a result of that. In verse 12, Job says, for it would be fire that consumes to Abaddon and would uproot all my increase. So in verse 12, Job is echoing the sentiment he's already expressed in verse 11. Adultery is a heinous crime worthy of judicial punishment by the judges in verse 11. But adultery is a sin that God will punish after this life. And if Job was guilty of such a vile sin like adultery, why would he essentially condemn himself? We think about, again, going back that we're a morally loose society, and, you know, I've met people, not Christians, but I've met people that think nothing of essentially having sexual relations with somebody else's wife. They're out of town or they're in prison, and they're not having any problems with it. She's willing to do it, but they don't really see the idea is this is the kind of stuff that God hates. You know, the idea you're not respecting the covenant of marriage. You're not respecting what God has said in his laws about human sexuality, and you're not afraid. Why you're not afraid? Because you see so much of it going on. You see it promoted, in television and movies, and there's really no fear of any kind of the fact that God is not approving of this activity. The fact that so many people do it, the idea is it must be acceptable because look at all the people that are in doing it. And to me, this is what people think. And to me, it really doesn't seem like that's that big a deal. It doesn't really seem like a bad thing. Abaddon, by the way, according to is it Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary, means a place of ruin or destruction. Abaddon is a place of ruin and Sheol for the lost or the ruined dead. And so, what's that? Yeah, sort of the idea that you have Sheol is sort of a equivalent in the New Testament for Hades. It's this place of departed spirits. But, you know, they didn't have a really good understanding of this place. They just knew that when you died, you weren't like Rover dead all over and you just disintegrate. They knew that you survived going into the afterlife, but they didn't have a lot of understanding sort of in the, the underworld, what exactly was going on in that place. I liked what the proverb writer wrote here, and I'd like us to look at Proverbs chapter 6. And Brother Ernest, would you like to read? Chapter 6, we want to read 27 to 32.
What verses?
27 to 32.
In chapter 6.
Proverbs 6, yep.
6. On account of a harlot, one is reduced to a loaf of bread.
Oh, is that 27, brother? Proverbs 27?
27?
27, 27, yep.
You said,
6.
yeah, chapter 6, right?
chapter 6, verse 27?
Yeah,
Okay.
he was reading 26.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
27.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think the 6 and 20, yeah, go ahead, no big deal. Sorry,
27 through 32.
32, yeah.
Alright. Can a man take fire in his bosom, and his clothes not be burned? Or can a man walk on hot coals, and his feet not be scorched? So is the one who goes into his neighbor's wife. Whoever touches her will not go unpunished. Man do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy himself when he is hungry. But when he is found, he must repay sevenfold. He must give all the substance of his house. The one who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense. He who will destroy himself doesn't.
Doesn't sound like that's a very smart idea, but it's, you know, the idea that the Bible sort of presents things in the reality. In other words, why would you do this? Why would you do this for somebody else? Because the idea is, you know, you can essentially find a woman and get married, and you can have your own life. Why would you do that to somebody else? That's just a terrible, terrible thing to do. She's somebody else's wife. Okay. If there's no questions, we'll go from verses 13 through 15, Ryan, if you want to read that.
Sure. If I have despised the claim of my male or female slaves when they filed a complaint against me, what then could I do when God arises? And when he calls me to account, what will I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him, and the same one fashion us in the womb?
Okay. So Job is saying he was fair to his servants that worked under him. And if they had some kind of grievances or complaints, he was really acted fairly and listened to them and really addressed the situation. It's like, I don't want to hear it, just get out there and do the work. The idea is he's really shown that, you know, he's a good man. He's a good man to work. Any kind of concerns or complaints come up, the idea that he is going to be a man that's going to listen to those things. Verse 14, Job says, what then could I do when God arises, and when he calls me to count, what will I answer? And here, the word arises in the Hebrew, according to Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, is God arising for action, especially of God's arising from his throne for judgment. So the idea is that if Job sort of ignored really the complaints of those that were his servants, and sort of just kind of blew them off and didn't really give attention to whatever issues they were having, Job is essentially saying, you know, God is not going to be happy with me. And so the fear that Job has here is that he knew that if he did not treat his servants well, then when he stood before God, that he is not going to be able to provide a good answer for why he did not. He will essentially be accountable for not treating him the way that he should have. And it helps us to be mindful that really all of mankind is accountable to Almighty God. And we're reminded about what Paul said in Romans 14, verse 12. He says, so that each one of us will give an account of himself to God. Boy, that clarity of mind as Christians, the idea is this, if we're thinking ahead, the idea is we're all going to be accountable to God for what we do. Boy, that helps us and serves us well in our day-to-day walk with the Lord, because we're like, you know, I'm going to be accountable. So if I say this, I'll be accountable to God. If I do this, I'll be accountable to God. And so the idea is once you have in mind the idea that you're going to be accountable for all these things, really, it helps you to make better choices in the face of temptation. And the idea is you're not going to become like the wicked and essentially say, well, you know, I'm just going to talk to others how I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to treat them however I'm going to treat them. If you know you're going to stand before God one day, and you've got that in your mind every day, the idea that I have a chance to do good or evil, I'm going to do good because I know one day I'll stand before God. That serves us well. Any questions or comments about that? Okay. Job says, did not he who made me in the womb make him, and the same one fashion us in the womb? What is he saying there in relation to context here we read in 13 through 15?
He knows about everybody.
Yep.
About their ways and what they're doing. So whether they're good or evil. You
Yeah.
know.
Okay.
I was just gonna say, he knows everything about us again.
Okay, true. But, it's very unique what he says here. The idea is is talking about God. Did he who made me, Job, in the womb make him? He's talking about verse 13, those servants. And the same one fashioned us in the womb, which means I don't have the right to sort of treat them, I better be careful in my treatment because, essentially, God made us both. And I'll be answering to God for how I treated people that essentially in God's eyes are sort of equal in his sight. Now they can be servants and he can be over them, but the idea is he doesn't have the right to sort of be a cruel master. He must treat them sort of with respect. Okay? There's no question, so let's move on to 16 through 23. So I think we are back to Brother Brian, if you want to read that.
Yep.
And that might be about it for tonight.
If I have withheld anything that the poor desired, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the fatherless has not eaten of it. For from my mouth the fatherless grew up with me as with a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or the needy without covering, if his body has not blessed me, and if he was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, because I saw my help in the gate, then let my shoulder blade fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken from its socket. And for I was in terror and calamity from God, and I could not have faced his majesty.
Does that sound like somebody who's a sinner to you that talked like that? Again, he's really
No.
talking about really Job, he has as a righteous man, has a reputation for kindness and humane treatment of the less fortunate. And so, the idea is he understands a punishment. If I failed to be kind and I, give humane treatment to those who are less fortunate, then here's what I can expect. You don't have Job sort of shaking his boots saying, I've done all these things, but the idea is here's what I know I can expect. I know that I'm not going to be on good terms with God. And so he's talking about verse 16 about the poor and their desire, the idea of necessities, or he says if he's kept really the necessities from the poor, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail. And so we think about, what does that mean? Cause the eyes of the widow to fail. And so think about the widow, and we got to remember that in ancient times they didn't have Social Security. They didn't have a lot of the things that we have now with government assistance and aid, but the idea that when you were a widow lady in ancient times, your Social Security system was your husband and your sons. And if you didn't have any sons and your husband was dead, this is a tough spot to be in. And so one of the things we learned from the law of Moses is there was responsibility. Now this predates the law of Moses, but there was responsibility that's spelled out that you have to look out for them, okay? But here, there's an acknowledgement, the idea that you got to look out for the poor and also the widow. And so the widow's eyes of the widow would fail because she was looking for fulfillment of something that she needed that never came about. And so the idea that sort of the hope failed, the idea that she didn't get what she needed. Job continues in verse 17, or have eaten the morsel alone, and the orphan has not shared it. Morsel, of course, is a portion of food. And the idea that, imagine him just eating that, and the idea that you have an orphan, sort of the fatherless child, and he hasn't eaten, and you didn't share it with him, okay? And so Job is not that kind of man that he's cold and callous and essentially is neglectful of the poor, the widow, and the orphan. And then he moves on essentially to show what kind of habit he's established in verse 18. But from my youth he grew up with me as with a father, talking about the orphan. And from infancy, I guided her, is really talking about the widow. The New International Version says, but from my youth, I reared them as a father would, and from my birth, I guided the widow. And here the word guided, the New American Standard, according to Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, means to treat kindly the helpless. Job was a man committed. You know, he was a wealthy man, but he wasn't thinking about himself and using it all on himself and his friends, but he essentially had a heart for those who were needy to take care of them.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask in your guys' is yours got a parenthesis around it? What does that mean?
Yeah. Verse 18, right?
Yeah.
It's got that. I'm not really sure. I guess I didn't take the time to really explore that, other than it seems to be the idea that he's busy talking about if I've done this, you know, sort of then, and then sort of in midstream in what he's saying, he just sort of has this sort of side note coming here, and that's probably why that, you know, it's in parentheses.
Yeah, I was just curious
Because it doesn't really fit.
What's the
It's
word
sort
in
of
the
like
parentheses?
sneaking it in between
The
what
whole
he's
verse.
saying.
The whole
Uh-huh.
verse is in parentheses.
It's kind of like a metaphor. It seems like, you know.
Well, it's just the idea that it's something that sort of comes into a whole list of things and stuck in there, even though it doesn't
those
really
things can
fit.
relate to that one. That
Yeah.
one's in the parentheses, then, right?
Yeah, it's just sort of something that is sort of put in there that doesn't seem to flow with what he's saying. In other words, Job said it, but it's sort of capped off the idea that it doesn't really seem to fit in the. Remember, when this was written, there were no chapter breaks in verses. Now, you know, the chapter breaks and the break down the verses sort of forces, you know, the translators to sort of deal with the material and sort of say, you know, this seems to just sort of be a note, a side note. It's sort of like when Matthew writes about something about Jesus, and then he'll just sort of say, you know, something about, and what Jesus was saying here was X, Y, and Z. Well, that's not really an account of what's happening. Matthew didn't know that at the time. Matthew wrote the gospel after the fact, and he's just sort of putting that in there so that you have that tidbit of information, but it really doesn't fit while you're reading it. And so, you know, it's got some kind of indication like that. Then he says, verse 19, if I have seen anyone perish for the lack of clothing, the idea of die, so, or the needy had no covering, so the idea of perhaps, you know, exposure to the elements, the idea that when the sun went down, in certain times of the year, the idea that it got really cold, and the idea is Job said, you know, I'm not a heartless guy. You know, if I seen something like that, essentially, you know, I would take care of them. Verse 21, if his loins, this goes to verse 19, verse 20 here. If his loins had not thanked me, and sort of the loins here is sort of, you know, the idea of a covering, sort of the lower abdomen. So the idea of clothing for the person who needs it. And if he has not been warmed with the fleece or the covering of my sheep. Then he says in verse 21, if I have lifted up my hand against the orphan because I saw I had support in the gate, let my shoulder fall from the socket. In other words, here's some punishment. This would be painful, the idea that your shoulder would fall off, which means the idea is that you're not going to have use of your arm, the idea that your arm would be broken up. This is really saying this would be a terrible thing to do. To essentially mistreat the helpless would be a terrible thing to do, and essentially this is really sort of the punishment that should come to anybody who would act in such a way. And then verse 23, he says, for calamity from God is a terror to me, and because of his majesty I can do nothing. Majesty, the idea of God being exalted, or, you know, God sort of being elevated. You know, God is going to have the final say in all the things that Job does. God is going to have the final act in what's going to become of Job. And so Job is mindful that had he mistreated the helpless, it was not going to go well for him. Again, it shows Job that, you know, he is a man who thinks righteously, does righteously. He is a righteous man. So we don't have time to get through the other verses all the way to verse 40, so we'll have to leave it there Fortnite, any questions or comments?
Well,
Okay.
we should, every day that we're alive, we should walk, as Jed was talking about, you know, being afraid of God's calamity upon us, you know, because when we're thinking about sin,
Right.
you gotta look at the repercussions.
Yeah, well, we
And
gotta
s-
recognize that we live in America here. We think about the world. The idea is that Satan has so permeated our society that people are desensitized to sin. So people do things without sins that they really just don't care or know that they're wrong. And so people do it all the time, and they act as if it's perfectly okay to use profanity, it's perfectly okay to disrespect people, it's perfectly okay to take things that belong to others. They act as if, you know,
The
no big
Christians are
deal.
the bad people
Yeah.
and stuff, bigots or whatever they say,
Yeah.
because they use judgment. You can't judge me, no, but
Yeah.
God can.
Yeah.
And stuff, so,
So
you
this is a
know,
warning. So if Job is telling us this is a warning really to anybody in his day that, you know, this is what sort of the punishment that'll come to evildoers, that God's not gonna have it.
people want comforted in their sin.
Yeah.
And when they're not, that's when
Yeah.
they get mad.
Yeah, well, that's because they want approval, and the idea is even if you got my approval of your sin, you're gonna be better off if I tell you what God thinks of it.
Yeah.
You know, mine is, it's not gonna do you any good if I tell you you're good to go, because you won't stand before me on the day of judgment. Thank you for joining us tonight, and God bless you. Hope you're able to tune in to another video next week, Lord willing.